Okay, so when you are ready to render your diffuse, okay, make sure you save a version of the file once you set everything up. Okay, here are the settings again. Okay, you are rendering at using mental ray. Okay, make sure your color management, you turn on apply output transform to renderer and set your output transform to 2.2 gamma. Otherwise your render images will be too dark. Okay, give a file name to your file and then set the image format as Targa or TGA. And next, ensure that you are using, for the frame animation extension option, name .hex.ext. Right, frame padding you can leave it at 4. Okay, for the frame range, you want to record from frame 1 to frame 200. If you have created another camera and set up the camera, make sure you choose, instead of your perspective, make sure you choose the correct camera. Otherwise, you'll be rendering the wrong view. In order to test and make sure that your frame is correct, you can click on the test render. Okay, to verify that you're rendering the correct frame before you send it out for batch render. Okay, so I'm going to close this. So to do a batch render, make sure you change from modeling to rendering, and under render, and then you hit batch render. Okay, where do you render the files? Okay, if you're not sure where the files are being rendered to, okay, this is the path. This will show you the path of the files. Okay, if you set your project properly, it will render into your project images folder. Okay, simple as that. Okay, so remember, name your files accordingly. So for example, dagger, I'm going to call it diffuse, so that all the files that will be rendered will be called dagger diffuse, then .001.tga for the first file, and so on. Then remember to save. Okay, save the scene. Now, in the previous earlier today in the lesson, I told you to set the rendering settings. So go to Windows, Settings Preferences, make sure your settings is at 25 frames per second, which we did earlier. Okay, so when we render this, this will be in 25 frames per second. So when you're ready to render, you just hit render, batch render. Okay, so I'm just going to execute the batch render. And then if you look at the lower right bottom, there is this script editor button. When you click on it, you can monitor the rendering process. Okay, right now it says I'm rendering with mental ray. And after that, you can see the progress. Your image, your first image will appear. Now it's showing rendering image number 1. Okay, then image number 2, and so on. Okay, so this rendering process will take a while, so I'm going to stop the rendering. So I'm going to click on render, and then I'm going to cancel the batch render. Okay, so I'm going to cancel this. Now, how do you render the grayscale? So let's pretend that we finish rendering the entire sequence. So now, how do you render the grayscale? So first, you save a file, save scene as, and then call it grayscale. Okay, I'm going to give it another version number, then save as. Okay, so this is just to make sure that in case you mess things up, you can go back to the previous version. So for this one, we need to enable a type of renderer called hardware renderer. Okay, similar to your renderer here, which is viewport number 2. Okay, so to enable the hardware renderer, you click on your render settings. Instead of using mental ray, click and change to Maya hardware 2.0. You will notice that the mental ray settings has disappeared and it shows you the Maya hardware render settings instead. So in order to give yourself a high quality version of your render, because we are using the graphics card to render, you will enable the anti-aliasing, okay, by enabling smooth wireframe and also multi-sample anti-aliasing as well. Sample count, if possible, use the maximum. Okay, so once you have done that, you can do a test render by doing a single frame. Okay, you notice that it renders really quickly. However, I can still see the textures on this, so I do not need this. I need to render in grayscale. So there's one more settings that I need to change. Right at the bottom, there is this thing called the render options. Click on render options. Make sure the render mode, you change it to shaded. Okay, change it to shaded so we can see the grayscale version. So I'm going to click on render again, and this is the result that you want. Okay, once you are happy with this, go ahead and save your scene. Okay, we already saved it as grayscale. Go to the common settings and rename your output. So instead of diffuse, you call it grayscale. Okay, this is very important, and go and save again. So once you're ready, you can go on and do the rendering again and do batch render. So this process I'll skip, okay, because we already rendered the grayscale in the previous example. So now you want to render your wireframe. So I'm going to save another version, save scene as. I'm going to rename this wireframe and save. Okay, so for this time, for wireframe, you want to go to Maya Hardware, and you go right to the bottom under the render options, change the render node to wire on shaded. Okay, to wire on shaded. You can do a test render to see what it looks like. Okay, now you notice that you can see the wireframe on the gray shaded version itself. Now, in order for us to composite this nicely on After Effects, we have to apply a surface shader texture on this model so that the white lines will stand out on a black surface. This will make the compositing easier in After Effects. So right now I'm going to close this. Yeah, I'm going to save. I already saved it as a wireframe, so I'm going to hit save just to save the scene. And I'm going to reapply another material to the model. So right mouse click, assign new material, and choose a surface shader. So this is the result that I want. Okay, a surface shader. Okay, so right now if I render again, I should just get wireframes on a black surface like that. So this is the result that I want. However, you notice that my wires are white. By default, the wires are not white in color, they are blue in color. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Okay, if I go to shaded mode now in my Maya, you notice that my wireframes are white in color, but the default color of the wireframes is not white. So to change it from blue, which was the original color, you go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Color Settings. Okay, let me just zoom in and show you. Go to Color Settings. Alright, so Windows, Settings, Color Settings, click on the inactive option, okay, and open up the objects category. Now by default, the wireframes for polygon surfaces is this dark blue color, if you remember. Okay, so we want to change it to blue, so go and drag the slider until the swatch changes into a white color and save. So now you're ready to render your wireframes. So because we already specified in our render settings wire on shaded, we can safely go ahead and render and batch render. But remember, before you do that, please go to the common settings and rename your file name prefix to wireframe. Then go and save it. Okay, and then you can go and render. And please ensure that you render in Targa format, because Targa will only, okay, Targa will give you that transparency for the background. you can actually take the background and make it transparent. Okay, so this is how you set up your renders. So I'm gonna stop the recording now. The second part of the video, I will talk about how to bring in these renders into After Effects.